Today, we're diving deep into what it means to truly infuse courage, handle the toughest of times, and raise kids who can stand strong against cultural pressures. Let's get started. I'm Natalie Tysdal, a journalist who decided enough is enough. I left a career that looked glamorous to do what I was scared of doing, going out on my own. I'm a married working mom of 3. On this podcast, we're going to talk about issues that really matter. Why am I not sleeping? What's up with that diet everyone's talking about? Are my kids falling behind? How do I leave that job and start over? Welcome to the Natalie Tysdal podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Natalie Tysdal podcast. I'm Natalie and I'm so glad you're joining me today. I have an amazing episode lined up that I think you are really going to love and be inspired by. Today we're diving into the idea of encouragement and courage. And yes, they work together. We're talking about the kind of encouragement that really sticks with you, the kind that gives you a backbone and helps you face life's hardest challenges head on. My guest is Hilary Ferrer from Mama Bear Apologetics. She is a return guest after being on the show earlier this year and getting great feedback from all of you about that podcast. We're going to chat about what it means to ground your encouragement in truth and reality, whether that be encouragement you give your friends or your family, especially your kids. It is so important. And we're going to get into why it's so important for them to have that true encouragement and courage. We're also going to talk about how to build courage by preparing for tough times and the role faith plays in all of this. Hilary has loads of wisdom, especially when it comes to dealing with modern challenges like societal pressures and the identity struggles so many people face today. We're going to explore everything from dealing with rejection and embracing your unique traits to tackling some big questions and sometimes controversial ones too. We are going to go there. Trust me, this is going to be a deep yet very practical conversation filled with tips and stories that will help you navigate tricky situations, support your loved ones, and maybe even mentor someone who really needs it right now. I want to tell you about a free resource that I put together after this episode, after I interviewed Hilary, and you can download it. It's on encouragement. It's called 15 Ways to Unlock and Build Courage. You can get that free download by clicking the link in the show notes or by going to my website, natalietysdal.com. Let's get into today's conversation with Hilary Ferrer. Hilary, good to have you on the podcast once again. And the topic I want to bring up today, because I am a big believer in empowering our kids.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they get to this weird age. I know every parent out there is thinking, I know what you're talking about, that tween, teen, and they get so insecure, everything in their life, unless they have something that they feel really good about, mm-hmm. that they just get weird. The teenage years.
They're just weird either way.
They're just weird. So how do we, even at the younger age, how do we give them courage?
Yeah. So first off, I want to just debunk the idea of what people think encouragement is. So encouragement is infusing courage. And so like usually when people, especially Christians, use the word encouragement, it's like, oh, your hair looks so good. Oh my gosh, you're the best at everything. And like, it's all these really things. Like, I remember when I was a kid, like one of my biggest insecurities is singing. And the reason why is because I could never get someone to tell me what they actually thought. They would come to me and they'd be like, oh my gosh, that was so good. And then they would go to another kid that I was like, that was awful. And I would hear them going, oh my gosh, that was so good. And I'm like, I have no idea if I'm as bad as that kid or if I actually am any good. And so I don't even believe what anybody says, because this idea of wanting to encourage was just making people feel good about stuff, whether or not it was true. Yeah. And that bothered me. I wanted to know what was true. So
I relate to this. I don't want to interrupt you, but I am so in tune with you, because this whole notion of believe in yourself, you can do it. And I do. I mean, sure, absolutely. We should believe in ourselves and you should try hard, but it's just so surfacey.
It's so surfacey, and it's not infusing courage. It's infusing all the feel goods, but like, we need to call that feel good in you. I'm going to feel good you. To make you feel good.
Sounds really creepy, but yeah.
I know. Yeah, it does kind of sound like something you could probably get arrested for, but infusing courage means there's a scary situation. I see the situation for what it is, and I have the courage to say, I am not going to back down in fear. And so probably one of the best examples I've had of what biblical courage looks like was several years back. I was speaking at a youth conference, and I had this girl and this guy. I was speaking on science stuff and, genetics and, all my biology stuff that I used to do primarily before I got into the cultural apologetics. But they were asking me just a bunch of questions. And so at one point she kind of gets real somber. And so she says, I have this fear. And she had already, shown me this girl radically loved the Lord, radically wanted to follow him. What do I do if I get raped and I get pregnant? Like, that's going to basically, that would stop my career. It would be traumatic. I would, would I give up for adoption? Like, would abortion be okay in that situation? And so she was like really wanting to know, because this was something that haunted her. And I said, you know what? It's true. There are things that you are going to have to shoulder that and I pointed to the guy that was sitting with us, he's never going to have to shoulder. He is never going to have to decide whether or not he wants to carry a baby to term in his body. I said, but part of following the Lord is whatever bad situation we are given, we learn a way to glorify God through that. Are you willing to glorify God even in bad, hard, situations? And she stopped for a minute and she thought, and I almost saw her go, like, sit up straight and go, okay.
Wow.
She prepared herself, and I hope this never happened to her, and I hope this doesn't happen to anybody, but she mentally prepared herself for the situation that she could get raped, she could get pregnant, and she would carry that baby to term. And the reason why is there was courage that was infused to her because she knew one thing about herself, and that was that she followed the Lord no matter what. This is what it looks like to follow the Lord in this situation. Everybody had made it all complicated. No, this is what it means to follow the Lord in that situation. I know that my identity, I follow the Lord. Okay, bring it on.
Wow.
And she was ready.
And this could be used in, gosh, you think of any difficult situation, glorifying God in our difficulties. That is some tough stuff. Yes. But as we talked about last time you were on the podcast, putting on that faith lens and saying, what does God want me to do? Putting that on first.
Yes.
Always. And it's in today's culture, that's a really hard thing to do.
And this kind of goes back to a lot of the stuff I talk about in our second book on the Guide to Sexuality, how what kids are doing a lot of times is they're categorizing information. And it's when things are in the wrong category that they are either acting in a moral way or they're kind of confused about doctrine. And so I'll just say this category that she have, the idea of this horrible thing happening to her was in the category of things that will wreck my career, change my life, and which will stop me on the road that God has me on. And it got moved to the category of things that I can do to glorify God even when they're hard. And that category right there was not scary for her because she knew who she was in Christ, that she would glorify God no matter what. And once we got it in the right category, she said, okay, that's how it is. And this is what encouragement is. It's infusing that courage. So we are looking at truth. We are looking at what's really going on. We are looking at everything kind of objectively. And then we are just saying, do I have the courage to continue even despite this? And knowing that we can continue on in Christ, being faithful, that can infuse a lot of courage. Now, if you have a kid who really doesn't know, if they haven't grounded their identity in Christ, that's not a powerful enough category. But there's a lot of ways of just preparing people. I find the other thing is that, in my opinion, the fear of the unknown, at least for me, is always the worst. And that would be either the unknown situation, I get blindsided, it's a question that I've never heard, it's a situation I haven't prepared for, even all the way down to, am I in a lake and I can't see my feet? That's the unknown right there, and I will get terrified. So for me personally, being able to almost use a sanctified imagination of putting myself in all these different situations of what's the worst thing that could happen? How do I mentally prepare for that? Okay, I'm ready for that. I've got a game plan. So if that happens, I've got a game plan. Now, we don't want to spend all our time obsessing over everything that could go wrong, especially if all it does is lead to fear. But if it's a way of almost kind of emotionally preparing yourself for something, this is where what's the worst that can happen actually becomes a really kind of sanctified game that you can play. There's so many people where they think, what is the absolute worst that can happen? And it's like they haven't named it. And maybe it's something like a kid trying to, trying out for a play. Okay, the very worst thing that happens is that your voice starts cracking and then you drool on yourself and everybody laughs. Okay, can I handle that? Have I seen people do dumber things than that? Yeah, I probably have. I can bounce back from that. That would really not be fun to do, but now we've named what's the worst thing that could possibly happen. Yeah. And sometimes just even in naming things, they become less scary when you realize it's not this kind of mysterious thing. So I don't know. In my opinion, that's one way of kind of infusing courage. But the biblical way of infusing courage is taking someone who really values the things of God and showing them how being faithful in those areas is something that they're called to be, and that something that they can handle, that God will empower them in that situation. Now, I distinguish that from God doesn't always empower us while we're imagining the situation. So I think about times like, if I was being tortured and stuff, I'm like, I don't know what I would do. But I can say in things that were really, really hard in my life, closest to torture I've ever had is probably the Whipple procedure I went through last year, which is a really horrific surgery. I don't think I would have been able to stand that in my own strength, but God provides that strength in the moment. And so also having that faith and that knowledge that every time I've gone through something hard, God provided the strength in the moment, even if I couldn't imagine it beforehand. Yeah. That's something that's also very empowering.
I think, I'm sorry you had to go through that procedure, and I don't know what it is, but I imagine it was really tough. And times that we think, I don't know, how can I? And then I had someone explain this to me in a beautiful way, that she was talking about a friend, and she was saying, I don't know how you went through this. I think she had lost a family member and stayed very positive. And the friend saying, well, you weren't in my shoes at that moment. God gave me what I needed in that moment, and you weren't in that moment. And it clicked with me, that was in the moment, he gives us what we need. We might not foresee, I don't know how I could ever go through that. Yeah. But when we're there, having that complete faith that he will get me through this, and I will wake up and the sun will rise tomorrow.
Yes. And that's where looking back is the thing that infuses courage for looking forward. Is if we can keep a gratitude journal, or just look at what did God do in this horrible situation? What did God do in that horrible situation? Yeah. We realize all the ways he'd already been faithful. Like there was this kind of training that I went through a while back for something. And they said, I want you to name one of your top ways that you have a hard time trusting God.
1 second. Sorry.
I'll start over with that.
Yeah. I have my phone off, but my emergency contacts go off. It's my husband. He's the one who calls me most. He's my emergency contact. Okay. Hold on one second. Let me just tell him.
If you want to take that, that's fine.
No, I'm not going to take it. I'm just going to say, don't call me back.
Or just say interview. Is this
yeah. Like said, can I call you later? Okay. Yeah. Pick up there.
So I'm trying to remember what I say. So they asked us, what is one of the number one things that you have a really hard time trusting God in? And so I listed that out. And then they said, okay, we want you to list 3 ways he's been faithful in the past. And I listed out those 3 ways, and I thought, holy cow, I did not struggle at all even. So I'll just say it right. It was finances. I have a hard time just, not so much anymore, but in the past when my husband and I were really living like hand to mouth, out of seminary and stuff, that like trusting God with the finances was really hard. 3 ways that God had been faithful. Like the first time I had cancer, we have no idea how in the world we did not go through our entire savings, because we didn't feel like we changed our lifestyle all that much. And yet we were always still able to pay our bills. Or when my husband and I were both out of work for 9 months, and like all these different places where everything should have totally gone, to the trash, and they didn't. And the Lord came through, and I thought, oh my gosh, I've been fearing this area that the Lord has shown me abundantly over and again that he will provide. And so it robbed that fear. And so sometimes looking back and saying, okay, this horrible situation, I remember God really being with me. I remember having this strength. I remember knowing what to do. I remember being able to do it and, do whatever it is that I needed to do. So I'm going to take that feeling of provision, that knowledge of provision, and then say, whatever it is that I imagine in the future, God can provide that same amount of provision there. Okay, Lord.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? What are we doing? All of that. It's not going to scare me, because I know that you can show up. Same thing for speaking engagements for me. Like I've said, I've got a lot of health problems. There'll be times when it's like I can't get out of bed until it's time to speak. And then when it's time to speak, I get up and the Lord provides the energy, and then I go crash afterwards. But in that moment, he provides the energy. He is faithful.
What about, so this is so good for kids and for us, but let's go in teaching that a little
Yeah.
bit more. So, when it's a young person who is going through, bullying or, something that to them feels like the world is crashing,
Yeah.
and they don't, maybe they don't have that foundation that you and
Yeah.
I do. Where can we go in the Bible to guide them, the stories we can tell them to really give them, our kids,
Yeah.
that courage?
I think this is really hard for kids because they don't have this history built up with the
Yes,
Lord of
right.
being able to look back. And I say this is a lot harder. And I think this is where we as adults passing on courage to say, here's the situation I was in. Here's how I saw the Lord use it. Like I have stories from the time when I really struggled with depression at one point, and I saw the Lord use it in my life to minister to people who I would have never been able to minister to.
Mm.
Or I see the benefits of how many health problems I have in the ways that I've been required to lean on the Lord. We have to tell them our stories of God coming through. The Bible stories are also great, but a lot of times
Mhm.
those are so miraculous that people don't think, well, of course they did it for them. We need to be passing on along our legacy of what God's done for us, and then telling them, like, the Lord can do this for you too. And sometimes it's going to be a little bit of that borrowed courage from us.
Mhm.
But are
Mhm.
we allowing them to borrow that courage in the sense that are we allowing to be vulnerable enough to share the things that really, really have hurt our hearts, that really make us vulnerable, in order to let them borrow the courage that now gives us?
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the biggest things.
Yeah. It's, I did parenting news for so many years and health news as a reporter. And one of the things that stands out to me that is so hard as someone who works with young people now and as a
Mm-hmm.
mom is that we should hope for hardship. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, what? I don't want
Yeah,
hardship for
it's
any of my
very
young people.
not intuitive, but we should.
If we protect them from every piece of hardship, then they never have to have courage.
Yeah.
They never build that.
I'll say that, like, I have a history of just not quite fitting in with girls and kind of having a lot of rejection there. And the fact that part of that was because I'm so analytical and I want to talk about all these different things. And so, you get that question, like, if you could go back and tell your teen self one thing, what would it be? And I'm like, I would tell her that her particular brand of weird is going to be like the Lord made me exactly like that for a reason, that now that makes
Mhm.
me really great at what I do now. And I don't have to worry about that fear of rejection because I lived rejection for so many years,
Mm.
that I don't even have to worry about that because I'm used to it. And so it's like the Lord's almost preparing us to be in the ministry that he's going to be having. So I have this girl that I mentor right now that's in high school. And so we talk about all the things that are struggling for her. And I was like, okay, your homework, you're going to go back this piece of your personality that you really, really hate. I want you to think of 5 different ways that this would make you perfect for a certain situation, for this job, for that ministry, for whatever. And she has to go and look. I know the Lord's created me like this. What are some ways that he can use that to where she can start embracing the parts of herself that maybe her classmates don't really like? And then we start using our sanctified imagination to glorify and thank God for creating us the way he created us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's such an awkward, like I mentioned when we first started, like there's just so much awkwardness in young people and finding just that I'm good. This is who God made me to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to sometimes give them a big hug and just say, you're perfect. Why do you think you're not? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what is it, the people around you judging you? Like, when can we just let that go?
Yeah. And the kid that's getting bullied, I would say, you know what? The Lord is preparing you for empathy. He is preparing you to be a warrior for those who maybe have been pushed to the side, who have been silenced, and you are going to be their voice one day. Back,
Yeah.
when you come out of this, you are going to be their voice because you know exactly where they're coming from. You know exactly how that feels. And you have the exact amount of righteous anger to stand up to people who are doing that to others. And this is a way that the Lord is preparing you. And I look forward to seeing the warrior that you become.
Yeah. And in the moment, that's hard for them to see.
Yeah.
But to reassure that and say, you'll look back at it. Journaling, like you said, like such a beautiful way for them to be able to look back and go, wow, I grew from that. What are some of the things at Mama Bear Apologetics you all really, I mean, I see the comments and I see how people react, but what are some of the big issues you're dealing with right now that you get asked questions about?
Ooh, let's see.
I mean, you all have grown so much, and I
Yeah.
know you're teaching so much along the way and giving courage to
We
the
get
moms like
so
me.
many different kinds of questions. We'll have people maybe that are coming that are saying, I'm hearing this teaching and it sounds like, we just had a lady recently who's basically on the verge of losing her faith because she got through one of her support groups, got turned on to like manifesting and all these things that they then drop Jesus's name in, kind of like, I don't know if we left it in the other podcast, people wrestling for that name of Jesus to rubber stamp whatever it is they're doing, to the point of where she's like, I don't even know if I'm a Christian. I don't know anything anymore. And kind of helping her to unravel maybe some of the stuff that she's been through before, and kind of instead of deconstructing, I'm trying to think, one of the Duggar girls says disentangling things from our faith, where we have to disentangle unhealthy things. So we get stuff like that. A lot of times we just get thank you letters from people that say, I was so scared about this topic or about that topic, or just what I saw going on in the world. And I feel like now that I know the words to use, now that I know how to address this, I feel ready. We've had a woman say, I've homeschooled my kids for this whole time and I feel ready to send them to public school because I know how to counter what they're going to hear now versus beforehand. The only thing she knew how to do was shelter them from it. And so I would say my favorite things that I get are when people are able to grasp the way we can prepare for the arguments that are out there and prepare our kids in the way they say, this is not something I need to fear anymore. This is something that I can actively engage. And then you'll have a lot of letters from women that are still in the process of getting there, of what about this topic? What about that topic, especially within sexuality? A lot of stuff within sexuality and just things.
Why do you think that is? I don't want to go too deep into that. I know how controversial it is, but versus 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, why are we seeing a 5 increase in a matter of a couple of years of girls identifying as transgender? Like the podcast I was listening to the other day, there are some aspects of that we can kind of chalk up to sort of teenage contagion, which girls can have a tendency to do, back in the 80s and 90s, that anorexia and bulimia were the big thing. And all of a sudden we had this explosion of all these girls identifying as that. And then cutting in the 2000s was the big thing. And we had this explosion of girls identifying as cutters. And now the big thing, right, is transgenderism. And we have this explosion of girls that are identifying as transgender and not quite sure what to do. So there's always going to be just this aspect of suggestibility, shall we say, and the fact that when we hear about something that we've never heard about as teenagers, a lot of times we were always asking ourselves, ooh, is that me? Like there's this I never watched the show Frasier very much, but for some reason I watched just enough of this one episode to have this epiphany for the rest of my life. So the show Frasier, he was a psychologist who did an on-air kind of show where people would call and ask him questions. And so he had this person call, and I can't remember what the person said. They're like, I think I'm struggling with, with this dissociative personality disorder and narcissism and blah, and just basically went down this whole list of psychological mental health issues. And he's like, what can you make of me? What can I do? Am I just, beyond hope? And Frasier stopped and thought for a second. He's like, well, it's one of two things. You're either the craziest person I've ever talked to, or you're a first-year psychiatry student. And you hear this awkward pause, and the guy goes, okay, thanks. And the meaning behind that is a lot of times when we hear something, we want to say, is that me? And so especially as young people, we're trying things on to see if that's us. And the more we hear about some of these things, the more kids are going to try them on and see if that's them. I mean, just think about what they're being told. And as far as transgenderism, if you don't feel comfortable in your body, if you don't really feel like you fit in, if you have some interest that other kids your gender don't have, well, maybe you're transgender. I'm sorry, but can you find me someone going through puberty
who's not uncomfortable
in their body, someone who's a teenager, no matter how popular they are, that feel like they really fit in? Most of the popular kids were always like, I kind of felt like a fraud.
That's so true.
It's something that everybody deals with, and they're saying, well, this is a sign that, and then, name your thing. Or, just with the cutting that they say, oh, I feel this relief when I cut. And so then other people are like, oh, well, if I'm feeling that amount of angst,
I can get that relief.
Maybe I can get that relief. Maybe that's my problem too. So, I mean, there's just all sorts of things that go into the sexuality, but I think just the proliferation of talking about all these options. And even our sex education, the national sex education standards, which are not mandated by the way, by the government, but have still made their way into a lot of schools thinking that these are the national sex education standards, actually say that, basically exploration of all these different identities is part of the growing up process, and sexual exploration is not exempt from that. So basically, don't knock it till you try it. You don't know who you are unless you try it all on. And this is explicitly said in the guiding principles section of the National Sex Education Standards.
Wow. It's shocking, but yet amplified by what we have talked about in the past of how media plays into this.
Yes.
And, growing up, for me, you had the nightly news. I'm age myself, but it's so accessible that it's like, well, maybe I need to try this, and then I can try that. And then there's cutting, and then there's this, and then there's all of these what do we call them? Like the silly things we should try because everybody else is trying it. The challenges and, all these things. It's like, oh, I can try that too. And so trying on all these different hats or ideas that are not based in faith.
Well, some of that, it really is finding your identity. I remember there was a girl back when I was in in my early 20s, and I worked with the youth group. And one year she was like the super hyper cheerleader, yay. And then the next year she dressed like black and goth. And then the next year she dressed all like sporty snowboarder. And it's like, I remember going through these phases. It's like, you have to almost take on this persona and then evaluate, is this me? Does this feel comfortable? And so people do that with trying out art, trying out, sports. They try out all sorts of different things to figure out what fits. It's when we start taking things that are dehumanizing us that really kind of, by dehumanizing, I mean, we're actually breaking apart what it means to be human. And that's what we're seeing right now with people starting to play with, am I actually, I'm trying to think of, the furry community, dressing up like an animal, or the ones that are saying, I can't remember the name. I usually have this off the top of my head, but there's this whole group that says, well, you've got fairies and sprites and all these kind of fictitious creatures. Am I one of those? Do I identify as that? You have fictosexual, which is where I'm just attracted to fictitious people. Like, this is what we're seeing happen a lot of times in the anime. In fact, there's a guy over in, I believe it's like in Japan or China, I think it's Japan, possibly South Korea, where he identifies as fictosexual. And so he has now been given massive grants to study this and to give lectures all over the world about it. And he actually married an AI character.
Oh my.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, some of it's just so out there that you think, okay, but then doesn't that just go away?
That's the unmaking of the human that we're seeing right now, just kind of on a massive scale. So it's like trying to discover who I am as a person. Once you start adding these things that are basically unmaking a human, then that's when you start having, you thought the anxiety and depression were bad beforehand. Hey, you have not seen anything until you see someone basically unraveling what it means to be a human, unraveling what it means to be a man, unraveling what it means to be a woman.
Yeah. Well, we started talking about courage. We talk about many other things, but how would you like to wrap it up on just having that courage and being prayerful for ourselves and for our friends and our kids in having a courage that is based in faith?
First off, I would just say we humans are really good with forgetting, and start now with some sort of, have one for your whole family that's a gratitude book. Or I've seen some people where they put this big jar out and it's a gratitude jar where you write down the things that you're thankful for and you put them in the jar. And then at the end of the year, you can pull out all these different areas where the Lord has been faithful.
Great.
I think the practice of gratitude, my husband and I have done this, that every night we talk about, what am I grateful for tonight? And places that I write down ways that the Lord has really shown up, because it's so easy to forget that God shows up when you don't have a written record of it. Yeah. And this is why you see in Old Testament them building these monuments in different places to remind themselves. It's a visual reminder that God was faithful, because we are prone to forget. And so I guess preparing yourself, knowing that you'll forget. What can I do with my family to make sure that we don't forget these ways that the Lord has been faithful, and that we're reviewing them regularly? Because I think as long as the future seems mysterious and you don't know if God's provision is going to come through, it's always going to be scary. But when you start looking at even bad stuff that happens, saying, what did God do through this? And then you regularly review it. And that's the thing. You got to regularly review it. That, I think, starts making the fear go down.
Yeah. I have an app. We talk about technology. It's not all bad, but a book, of course, like a gratitude journal, like such a great way to do that, especially for kids before they go to bed at night. Like write down as many things as you can, come up with at least 3. If you can get to 10, great, but to continue to do that. But I have this app that, and I'll put it in the show notes, that we started using. And it was such a great way through a hardship that we went through to journal. And what was so great about it is that you can attach a photo to it. I think it's called Diario or Diary, but I used to speak into it because that's easier than typing on my phone. But I could attach things to it, and then I could tag it. So I could tag it with school or travel or fear or anything like that. So then I can go in and I can say, when I felt fear, here are all the things that would come up under those diaries that would come up under those tags. Yeah. Like and maybe for kids, because they relate to the technology, like such a great way and we were using it to journal through a hardship, but then I realized it became very much things we were thankful for and grateful for. And I loved being able to tag some of those things. And now I can go back in and find those moments a little bit easier. So that might be a fun option for. And
how do you feel after if you're realizing I'm feeling fear and you go listen to that, what changes in you when you listen?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I did it. My son did it, and then I did it, and then you can email your diary for that day or send it to someone in a text so there's some great tools out there, but a good old fashioned gratitude journal might just be the best way.
Have it sitting in the family living room somewhere.
Yeah.
Or that jar,
I
in
love
the kitchen.
that jar.
Yeah.
Maybe bring it out at the end of the year.
Yeah.
So great. Hilary, thank you. It's such a pleasure. And I love what you're doing. I will link Mama Bear Apologetics in the show notes. Listen to their podcast. You will learn so much. I promise it'll be one of those podcasts where you have to write things down because you're going to want to remember the things that they say. All the best to you and to Amy, and I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much. Love being here.
Thank you for joining the Natalie Tysdal podcast. You can follow along on Instagram and at natalietysdal.com. Subscribe to the show to catch every new episode and leave a review so I can continue to bring you fresh content. See you next week.